Hi guys, and welcome to my channel. If you haven't seen any of my videos before, in this video I'm going to be showing how I made this Roe Buck Mount out of a piece of English yew and some steel threaded rod for the antlers. So I was given this yew log a few months ago by a farmer who's a client and friend of mine. He'd had this stuck in his barn for about 30 odd years and just didn't want to see it go to waste. So I had this idea for a while to make a deer head mount of some sort or the other, and I decided to go for a roebuck. It wasn't quite big enough for either a fallow or a red deer. So while I'm working on the deer, you'll see I'll be marking out features with charcoal as I go. Charcoal is brilliant for this. It marks the wood really easily, and it also can be removed really easily as well. I found when I've been using Sharpies in the past, they get gummed up after a while. They're quite expensive, whereas charcoal is cheap and readily available. Definitely a very good thing to use. So obviously I removed the basic chunks of the wood with chainsaw after marking up, and then I'll remove more with, at the moment I'm using a power planer tip by Arbortech. That will certainly chew through the wood. Definitely want to have your gloves on for that one. I also use flap sanding discs as well. You've probably seen me in my other videos, but yeah, for this hardwood, especially yew, it certainly removes a lot of material. I have various other attachments as well. I like to have 2 or 3 working angle grinders at a time, so I don't have to keep swapping tips. And later on you'll see me use something called a contour sander, and that's really good. It's a very small sanding disc, and has rubber plate behind it, and it flexes around any contours in the wood, and you get a lovely finish out of it. And you go down to quite a fine grit. I went down to 600 grit with this yew to get a beautiful finish. The wood almost looked like stone. It's so smooth and hard. But yeah, definitely recommend anybody doing this sort of work. If you're just starting out, if you can get your hands on one of those, they're not cheap, but you get a beautiful finish with the contour sander. Okay, so I'm doing some more finer detail on the deer at the moment. I'm using a chisel. Actually, just doing finer and finer detail. At the moment, it kind of looks like a donkey because of this funny white muzzle and the pointed ears. I needed to bring them, just because of the shape of the wood, I had to kind of angle them back, but I'll be changing the shape of them, because at the moment they still look a bit donkey-ish. So I'll change the shape. Sometimes it's just a matter of trying to get the sculpture to fit the wood. Sometimes it's very hard to find a reference that is really going to work, so there is no real reference for this, to be honest with you. I have a look at various pictures every now and again, But at the end of the day, you've got to get the sculpture to fit the wood. So another thing, I'm not going to be working on the neck, not until the rest of this is done. It just, because it's going to add more stability, and I actually have a coach screw in this holding it in place, well, loosely in place anyway, just gives a bit of stability. So once I've got all this carved, then I'll work on the neck, but I want to fine tune the face beforehand, and then once all of that is done, I'll then start working on the antlers, which would be a little bit of a surprise. So here's the next process, is the making of the antlers. So I've drilled 2 pilot holes in for these coach screws. So that's that phase taken care of, and they'll go all the way in. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the majority of the antler out of this 20mm threaded rod. I'm going to use this nut as the base. I'll weld it on, and then I'll carve it into shape. I'm going to model the antler on this bit of wire. I married it up with the deer's head, just to get a scale, and I can copy the next antler as well, base it on this kind of dimension. So that's going to be the rough shape that I'm going to go for. Right. Okay, so we'll start off by cutting a slight angle or a notch into the threaded rod. I can then bend it to the angles that's similar to the wire, very crude piece of wire that I used as a template. I know it probably looks very obscure to anybody, but that something like that gives me a plan to work with, and then I then work on the other antler. This is basically the main central piece to the antler, as it runs up to the last point in the antler. I can then bend them so that they're symmetrical to each other. So now doing a bit of work on one of the lower points and forming them into shape. That's using 10mm threaded rod. Just cutting top section to taper it. I do a lot of shaping and forming simply by clamping this angle grinder in a vise. Yeah, it's very effective. So welding the lower points onto the antlers, I did them both at the same time just because I wanted to get them looking pretty symmetrical. And then once that was done, I could then, once they're fixed in place, I can then build up the weld around the top and the bottom section of these points and blend and merge them into the main stem of the antler. One last point to weld on the top, also cut out of 10mm threaded rod. So for the last details, I have used a very poor quality weld to get it just to stick on the surface to give this rough effect, which looks very much like the base of an antler. I think it looks great. So, quick jump into the future. The antlers are now pretty much complete. I've tidied them up with a sanding flap disc and also an angle grinder cutting into some of the globules to give it more of a ridged effect. And I think they look fantastic. I'll certainly be making more of these. I think they're beautiful in their own right. You can see I've welded a coach screw on the end of them, and they screw in beautifully into the top of the antler. It took some time. I had to cut some of the wood off because obviously the screw only goes in one way, and I had to get it so they're pointing the right way with a flat surface on the on their base on the head of the deer. Okay, so here are some real roe deer antlers, not quite as well formed as my metal ones, which look like they are based on fully grown roe deer antlers. I got these antlers, oddly enough, off a roadkill deer, which was quite fresh, so I took it home and prepped the meat. That's probably another video in its own right. So we're not going to go into that. Anyway, yeah, so you can see that they look quite similar, copying those characteristics of these real roe deer antlers. So before I do anything else with these antlers, I decided to just give them a clean off with a wire brush and a drill attachment, just to shine them up a little bit more. There was some oxidation in certain parts, which is making it quite black. But I need to do this before we go on to the next section of prep work. So this is one of the last bits to do, is actually burnish the steel antlers with a blowtorch. There's various different temperatures when you heat the metal. You get different colours. I mean, there are colour charts online if you want to do something similar to this. Some people even put them in an oven or a furnace to get a particular colour to blue the metal. But I use a blowtorch and just do it by eye. But you get these fantastic colours, these amazing rainbow effects of golds and purples and blues and greys. And I think that the colour blends in nicely with the various shades and tones of the yew wood. So I just thought it was a nice touch. They would have looked odd if they were just left grey. and kind of boring. Well, it'd be all right, but it just adds another dimension to it. So now just to do a few bits of pyrography work on the deer head. There are patches of black fur and white fur around the muzzle of a roe deer, and I was very fortunate in some ways to have this bit of rotting sapwood around the section of the sculpture. So I can just highlight some of the darker areas and the blackness of the muzzle, and it gives it a more of a realistic texture by burning the wood so much around the nose as well. I kind of like that. So I use the Dremel blow lamp to darken and mark the eyes as well, and I'll finish the finer details with the pyrography pen around the edges. So jump into the future again. The piece is now finished. I've coated it with Danish oil, and you may notice as well on the neck I've burnt a bracken leaf on there. I just fancied putting a bit of artwork on there as well. I just like the idea of it being stood in some bracken like its natural habitat. And with the antlers now put on after having them coloured and putting the oil on there to highlight the grain of the ear, I just think it's an absolutely fantastic piece. The wood grain just works so well with this sculpture. So I'm definitely going to be keeping my eye open for more pieces of yew. So this deer has now gone off to my gallery, which will be showcasing a lot more of my stuff. I'll probably do a video about that later on as well. Thank you so much for watching the video, and if you enjoyed it, then please like it and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out. Thank you so much. Bye.